So last episode, we had Patricia McMillan from Ontario Tech University co-host and interview Sally Gardner from University of Oregon. So we're doing that again today. On this episode, we have returning guest Ryan Scheckel from Texas Tech University. Ryan, how are you?
Good. How are you doing, Matt?
Probably as Toby Maguire's Peter Parker says, trying to do better. So last time we were chatting about the art exhibition that will be happening at the NACADA Annual Conference in Portland this October. But today you're back on to have the interviewing duties. So Ryan, I'm super excited for this interview. Take it away.
Thanks, Matt, for having me. I've never been on this side of the questions before, so hopefully I won't mess it up too much. We have some great guests, that's for sure. And I'm excited to talk with Dave Lochtie and Ben Walker today. Dave is the operations manager for the Personal Advisory Service at the Open University, which provides targeted one-to-one support for student populations identified in the institution's access and participation plan. Dave is chair of the UK Advising and Tutoring Association, or UCAT, which supports personal tutors and academic advisors across the UK, as well as co-chair of the Association for Peer Learning and Support, which promotes best practices in student-led learning. Dave is a qualified teacher and co-author of Effective Personal Tutoring in Higher Education. He's worked in student services management roles at the University of Derby and the University of New Orleans, as well as serving as elected director, trustee, and governor of the University of Roehampton and Bournemouth University Students' Union. Dave is passionate about student voice, engagement, and student success. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm very happy to be here.
Sure. Ben is a senior lecturer in educational development within the Oxford Center of Academic Enhancement and Development at Oxford Brookes University, where he supports colleagues to gain fellowship of the Higher Education Academy, deliver staff development, and undertake educational research projects. Previously holding positions at the University of Lincoln, Manchester Metropolitan University, and the University of Derby, Ben has supported a wide range of trainee teachers and existing practitioners. Ben has been program leader for the postgraduate certificate in learning and teaching in higher education and been invited keynote speaker at national and international conferences. As co-author of books and journal articles on personal tutoring, Ben is at the forefront of professional development and research in the field and is committed to developing it further. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was reading your bios from this new book, Personal Tutors and Advisors Companion, translating theory into practice to improve student success. So congratulations, number one, on the publication. But you also worked with a third editor on this text. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how it came about and the background for the publication.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Ryan. I suppose, at this point, I wanted to give a massive shout out to our third party and co-editor who can't be with us this afternoon because Andrew Stork, to give him his official name, is the kind of ideas man, to be honest. So without him, we wouldn't be here. That's really true. So a massive shout out to Andy. He's been a great person to see the sort of opportunity that existed in the literature, the gap in the literature, and I suppose him being a marketing lecturer, a gap in a business opportunity as well, I suppose, in those terms, to see the need for this book. How it came about, I suppose there's a long and short answer, and if I give the long answer, that's probably going to tread on the toes of the following answer about our sort of background. So the brief answer, I guess, is that it's aiming to be the companion to our 2018 publication, which you mentioned in Dave's biography, which was a handbook, really, a handbook underpinned by research for personal tutors and academic advisors. But that was authored by four of us. So the three of us already mentioned, and Emily McIntosh, who's now at Middlesex University. But what we really strongly wanted to do is kind of give that text a kind of real world application specificity, I suppose. And that led sort of Andy being the ideas man and us developing it further to say, how about going out to the sector in the UK and saying, what about real life case studies in institutions where they hopefully have applied the themes and concepts of the 2018 book, and we can get them all to write a case study and sort of evaluate it and hopefully get it published. And amazingly enough, it ended up happening.
Yeah, it's super exciting, and we'll definitely talk more about the book through this podcast episode. But as you get to know folks and you get to hear their stories, oftentimes you find access points from personal journeys or experiences or roles at institutions or whatever. And so I want for our listeners to sort of set the stage for that. Dave, if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into higher education and what your current role is like at your institution.
Thank you. Yeah, so I started off working in higher education at graduation. I was elected as the vice president of my student union, which I don't know how entirely that translates to American international institutions, but I led the student union for a year, elected by my peers. And when after that I became a teacher, and I was working in primary schools, which was great fun, and I loved working with young children. But I always had in the back of my head that universities was where I'd really got the interest in education. So I returned back to that in 2008, worked at the University of Roehampton, and really what ties everything together that I've done from that point on is supporting students. I've done it with various different role titles. That kind of my officially my role was this, and I did all of those things, but I felt like I was student facing in every role, or manage people that are student facing, and then you respond to whatever the challenge is in front of you at different points. So I've done that from being part of an academic department directly related to a course. I had the opportunity, as you said, to work at the University of New Orleans, where I worked as a student success coach and counsellor, so really working with students one-to-one. When I returned to the UK, I've done work at the University of Derby, managing student voice and peer-assisted learning, which I'm very passionate about. And then finally now at the Open University, which for anyone that doesn't know it is an organisation which is almost entirely online, and our students are from across the UK. It's the largest institution in the UK, and we have a large population of students that you might describe as being disadvantaged or to have barriers to higher education, and the kind of purpose of the Open University is in the name, to be open to them, and particularly my department is all about supporting those students through advising, coaching and mentoring, and facilitating student success. So it's through that I've got involved through organisations like UCAT, and then on to NACADA as well. I was fortunate enough to go to the Las Vegas, Nevada conference a few years ago, which was an amazing experience. So I've always been, with the work that I've done with Ben, the books that we've spoken about, always looking towards the States and internationally when we've had the opportunity to do so, to really learn from all the things that, whilst we have differences, there's more that we have in common, and it's supporting students. It's the heart of all of that.
Certainly. And I know that Vegas 2015 was significantly larger than any other conference I've been to. And I know on this end of the pandemic, sometimes it's hard to imagine those days and what they look like. But I'm curious, Ben, about your background and how you got into higher education, as well as your position at your institution currently.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Well, I suppose my story starts 20 years ago, although I've actually only been in higher education properly, if you like, since 2017. So it's actually a lot more recent. But prior to that, I was in further education, which I guess is going to be community college in the States, probably. So yeah, about 20 years ago, I've been in teaching about 20 years. I did my teacher training while I was working in a bookshop. Well, let's go back a little bit even further. So I'm an English, I think we might have some common ground here, Ryan, but I'm an English graduate. I did English and history. Then I did an MA in English literature, a master's. And then I did that thing where I kind of drifted into, should I do a doctorate, a PhD, and didn't have the time, didn't have the money or the inclination at that point. Slight regret there, but there you go. So, of course, what you go and do, you go and work in a bookshop for 3 years, which is what I did. And nothing against working in a bookshop, because it was good in many ways. But a very good friend of mine from the Masters, who I'm actually in a band with still, as middle-aged men, he said, maybe something a bit more stimulating for you. I've just done the teacher training. I know you don't want to work in a school, which I never did particularly. Nothing against school teachers again, but I never really desperately wanted to. But he said, I've just done the teacher training for post-compulsory education and training. So what we would call further education or community college. And I think you would like it. And I didn't get in on the year he did it. I did it the year after. So I did my teacher training then and got a job at Chesterfield College. I live in Sheffield, and Chesterfield is about 10 miles south of here. And I got a job as a full-time English teacher eventually. After doing that for full-time English teaching for about 7 or 8 years, I became what rather grandly, sounds more grand than it was, but head of English, basically the head of department, which is not quite as grand as a head of department in HE, but nevertheless, I had a team of people under me whilst teaching alongside, but being a manager. And then it's those strange twists of fate that we always talk about, don't we? About how do you get into advising? No one seems to have decided one day, I'm going to get into advising. It happens in some strange, as I say, sort of twist of fate or some strange happening. And in my case, it was a bad thing that hopefully turned into a good thing, in that effectively I got made redundant, or my role got made redundant whilst at the Sheffield College, which I was then working in as a manager, within curriculum, within department. And effectively they reduced the number of roles. I effectively got made redundant, and within 2 weeks I had to apply for a job. Well, sorry, I was encouraged to apply for a job at the same level called Learner Success Manager, which was in student support and experience. And I got that job. So that was in 2011. And at that point, the link to advising is coming soon. At that point, that job was brand new. We had a team of staff under us who you might call professional tutors, or under a centralized personal tutorial system, so more like primary role advisors in the States. And we managed those people. So effectively in the college, we were given the task of implementing a centralized new tutorial system in the college, which was, in equal share, challenging, daunting, scary, and exciting. And then what happened is a guy called Andy Stork, who's already been mentioned, in 2013 got the same position as me. So there were 3 of us fellow managers, and I'd known him from when he was a business teacher and I was an English lecturer. And he saw rather an opportunity, a gap in the market, and a gap in the literature to sort of, we've implemented this new system. It does seem there is a real need here to sort of help people out with the professional development of personal tutoring and advising. So that gave rise to a book that eventually got published in 2015 for the further education context, which has its kind of revised editions. They're not officially called that, but they're kind of counterparts in HE, which is this book we're talking about today, and its predecessor in 2018. So that's what happened then. Around that time, I was a student support manager in a college, which was very, very interesting, with loads of social problems walking through the door. And it was kind of mine and my staff job to see those students in very challenging circumstances through their studies. So we learned an awful lot at the time. But during that time as well, I got into teacher education, which is effectively teaching the course that I had done, back in sort of 2001, 2002. And so basically that was higher education, but located within further education. So what we call higher in further education here in the UK. And that was in partnership with Sheffield Hallam University. And, as time went on, I was looking to get a full-time role within a university. And I saw a job rather nicely advertised for a research position, or working on a national research project into personal tutoring, which was rather handy, at the University of Lincoln, working with 3 other universities, just a 2-year contract. But that's how I got into HE in the first place. And as those 2 years started to come to an end, I was applying for teacher education jobs, but this time, within HE. So things like teaching on what we call here the postgraduate certificate in higher education, which is the qualification that all lecturers basically who want to teach within universities in the UK either need to have as a qualification or be working towards, once they are with us. So those are the jobs I went for. And then through various different temporary contracts and fractional, part-time situations that we all know and love, working at Manchester Metropolitan University and Derby, doing that wonderful thing of having half a job for, having a job for one half the week and another job for the other half the week, and everyone thinking you've got one job in one place and you feel like you've got two full time. Eventually, I managed to get very recently, actually, a full-time permanent job in doing something very similar at Oxford Brookes University, which is located in a academic development unit, which has a bit of a history and reputation in what we call academic development, which means supporting trainee teachers. And through that time in HE, obviously at Lincoln, but then in the subsequent jobs at Manchester and Derby and at Oxford, I've always had a hand in, for obvious reasons, I guess, the overview, the institutional implementation of academic advising or personal tutoring, which, as I'm sure we'll come onto, in the UK is something that's is a constant need. Let's put it that way. We're certainly not there yet. Hence the work we're doing in this area. And at the same time, within the last few years as well, I've been alongside Dave in the leadership of UCAT, which I did for a couple of years. I was vice chair professional development and then just vice chair for UK advising and tutoring under David Graham with Dave and Emily until my term expired about a year or so ago. And in that time as well, I put together the Tutoring Matters webinar series that we have for UCAT, which has been a really good sort of source of engagement, hopefully for all members. And then obviously David Gray's taken that organisation on in massive ways in terms of the professional standards and professional recognition and all the stuff he's doing as well. So yeah, that's me up to date, I think.
Excellent. I know we had the opportunity to be in the same spaces not too long ago, but it feels like it was so long ago. Sheffield in 2017 at the NACADA International Conference, Plymouth in 2019 at the last in-person UCAT conference, which I enjoyed tremendously being a part of. If you wouldn't mind, Dave, tell us a little bit about the takeaways that you have on this side of leadership and on this side of planning conferences. Currently, the UCAT conference is going on virtually right now, as we were discussing earlier. Talk a little bit about your experience with UCAT, with NACADA, and the role that professional organizations play in your professional identity and your development.
Yeah, I've always thought that it's important to have that working with colleagues across an entire sector and international sectors as well. You have colleagues that you work for an institution, and that's important, and you share that. But I think it's always good to step back in everything that you do. And that's why I wanted to work with Ben and Andy and Emily on the books. It's why I got involved with UCAT as the organisation formed around about 2015. And I found that through going to conferences like those, it would, when you step back, that you really you find your people, you find people that you've got things in common with, and it's not that you don't have that in your day-to-day job, but just that passion for student support was what shone through. And I always felt when I came away from a UCAT event and then later a NACADA event that there was that commonality with people, that we're all there for students and we all take things on and are very passionate about that, and that just really spills into the conferences. And the keynote speeches are excellent. The workshops and presentations are excellent, but I always found it was the conversations in between those that I got almost the most value from all of the different people, because you're hearing about day-to-day practice. And as you said before, that the Vegas NACADA conference was on another level for me. It was numbers that I'd never imagined could happen in a conference. We don't have as many advisors and tutors that we could get at a UCAT conference, and it was really fantastic to see that many people with a shared interest and different passions, and you could choose between lots of different sessions and really hone in on the things that kind of work for you. Going to the NACADA international events that you spoke about before, just hearing, it was great to hear it across the pond from the US and from the UK as well, but also internationally, because advising means different things to different people. We touched a little bit on the fact that we tend to use the terms personal tutoring, and they're very similar, they're exactly the same. So always for me, hearing those different interpretations, because there's definitely no best way of doing things. There's lots of different types of good practice. So I've seen that through those NACADA international conferences, had the opportunity to travel to Beijing with NACADA colleagues and seeing how other countries view advising and what impact they seek to have with students. And I guess we've all seen in the last few years the impact of going online, the benefits that can bring, both in our wider world, but then also in our conferences. It's meant for me that there's certain barriers to me going to conferences which don't exist, of geography and expense and time and things like that. But we have missed out perhaps on some of those maybe late night conversations that you might have at a conference, where you can have a drink or two maybe and discuss with people and really kind of find out what it's like to be in the other person's shoes a little bit more, and people speak very candidly. So we've tried to keep that going when we've had online conferences. I guess as we move into the future, we're trying to get a bit of the best of both worlds, so that people can get across those barriers and can engage with things, but we don't lose that human sense of kind of that direct interaction that you have with somebody that you have in an in-person conference. So that's where we're at with UCAT today, literally having our conference at the moment. We're online at the moment, but we've got an in-person event taking place in a few weeks' time, which I think will be good to start to get people to see each other face to face again.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was thinking about preparing to talk with both of you about this. I've had multiple opportunities to understand the different terminology sets, the different perspectives, but then to see how much really is common, how much we do share, especially the focus on student success and the different types of needs and concerns that students bring to advisors and tutors. But the majority of this podcast audience is US or North American advisors. And we've had other guests from other countries on the podcast. I'm going to signpost or flag up a couple of podcast episodes. Number 22 is our mutual friend, David Gray, CEO of UCAT. But also number 37, episode 37, our friend Ann Bingham, she shared a little bit about her experience and her background in higher education and how she approaches personal tutoring. But I'm curious, Ben, especially since you mentioned the history background and your background in approaching the sector of higher education from further education. The term tutoring in the United States usually is supplemental or additional instruction, often individualized around a course or a subject or a specific learning focus. Is there an easy way to explain sort of the heritage of how personal tutoring came from the tutorials structure for folks who may not understand the difference between, say, lectures, tutorials, seminars, and so on in a UK setting?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm not sure there's an easy way, but it's an interesting one. The history of it is interesting. We try and do a very, very, very potted history within the beginning of the 2018 book, where we even sort of look at the dictionary definitions of tutor, etc., and coach and all the rest of it. Quite interesting. But it sort of goes back to Oxbridge in a sense, and the dons at Oxford and Cambridge and the tutorial system then. So you're talking about centuries ago, because it is quite interesting. In the UK, it's seen almost personal tutoring, and it's just, this is a kind of newfangled thing, and you're like, no, hang on. This goes back as long as higher education goes back, and so it's quite sort of important to emphasize that, whilst at the same time maybe acknowledging we've changed a bit since then. It's not quite the same as turning up to a glass of wine or whatever with your tutor in an Oxford college in the quad or whatever. But yeah, I mean, when you look at it, it does goes back that far. And in that sort of history, we look at the sort of idea of the university and over the centuries leading up to the sort of 20th century, that idea of a sort of personalized learning approach has arguably always been there. And then it's been, in the last few decades, sort of really seen as sort of outdated and not fit for purpose. And there's been an awful lot of kind of reviewing of the situation and what this thing is, and a lot of confusion, if we're honest, and lack of clarity. And it's really sort of waxed waned in terms of its the emphasis put on it. But the debate is a complex one, because what you're saying, Ryan, is really, really true. Because if on the one hand I'm saying it's always been there, and on the other hand we're saying, hey, look, there's this thing called personal tutoring, it doesn't get any attention. Why is that? And I think it comes back to something, a debate that a discussion that you can go round and round on, which is about the relationship between, in UK terms, personal tutoring and teaching. And the premise for, and that's an interesting debate, because you could say, well, the books we've produced and the development, the staff development and the stuff we've written about and the papers we've got out there, is it just all part of the wealth of literature that already exists on teaching approaches? And the answer to that, of course, is, well, yes and no. Yes, it partly is, but the problem is that the premise for this stuff is that I became a teacher, and I had this thing on my timetable called personal tutoring that, having done my teacher training, no one had prepared me for whatsoever, really. So therefore, okay, I'd been trained in teaching, but how come I have to then do this thing that is arguably an aspect of teaching, so the same and yet different? And that's, I think we call it that in the introduction to this latest case study, that it's intertwined with teaching, it's got a lot of common with it, and yet it has some distinct features. And if I turn up as a new teacher and then you get to the job, and my manager, who was a great manager, by the way, but my manager and close colleagues don't really either tell me anything about it, then surely there is something missing here. So that's what the gap that we're trying to fill. It's the gap that UCAT is trying to fill. It's the gap that we've tried to fill with the books, with the staff development that we have associated with it, with various of the initiatives that we've tried to start off. And I guess, therefore, what's missing is, to go back to your question about how to differentiate it. Maybe, I think what you're asking, how do you differentiate it from other aspects of an academic's practice with students? Then it is an emphasis on the whole student. It's an emphasis on the journey of the student. It's an emphasis on the pastoral aspects of students. That, again, and what it is as well is the reason for keep on going on about personal tutoring and advising and trying to define it and clarify it, is because it tends to, like I said, when I was a newly trained teacher, or when we appoint lecturers or teachers, they just have a line in their job description that says, you will do personal tutoring, generally, and that's it, with no kind of what that means. Whereas the teaching thing has a load of sub bullets under it saying, marking, assessment, curriculum development, teaching delivery. What should those sub bullets be for personal tutoring and advising if we're really going to take this seriously? And it's a timetabled activity. And then I think what's happened then is that's gone hand in hand in the UK anyway, with a real change in the student body. So, as I mentioned, I've got a further education background where you have behavioural issues, you have discipline issues. There's a lot of social problems there. There's a lot of what am I trying to say? Diverse issues that students present with that we have to support. And higher education has increasingly mirrored that, for obvious reasons, because the further education students of today are the higher education students of tomorrow. So therefore, what you've got is a bunch of academic higher education staff who may have been in higher education for 20, 30 years when this stuff wasn't really paid much attention to. The student body has changed. There is a diverse range of needs that we need to support students on, and the staff development has not kept pace with those changes that have happened. So yeah, I guess that's a sort of long roundabout way of answering your question, that it's all those things that we know kind of come into your classroom that impact on learning, that we need to support students with, that we arguably aren't necessarily very equipped for. So it's a sort of Venn diagram situation where there's a big overlap between personal tutoring and teaching, but a lot of that personal tutoring stuff to date has been somewhat undeveloped, which is hopefully what we're trying to address.
Yeah, certainly. And, having received the book and read through it, definitely the themes of students or student populations, it comes out, especially in a case studies structure, because everything is situated in actual practice, even if they are in some ways made academic for the purpose of the case study. They're real people in real situations, addressing real personal tutoring matters. And I really appreciated that thematic nature, but also the structural element of case studies. You talked a little bit about how it came about and how Andrew recognized the the thing that was missing, and then also the opportunity to provide a companion to the 2018 book. But you have done something that I don't know. I know a lot of people are working on, but don't really understand fully. You published a book in the middle of a global pandemic. And I would imagine that experience, even as editors, was unique in many ways. Something that, just like it sounds like sometimes advising and personal tutoring, nobody's really prepared for. But I'm curious about your experiences in the just getting done the making of a book, especially during the last couple of years. What were some of the surprises that came from being a part of this process? Dave, if you mind going first.
Yeah, no problem at all. I think it was surprising. We touched a little bit on how much we have in common, despite, because we focus on how, like, the diversity of the sector and the diversity of the students that we're supporting, all of which is true. But reaching out to colleagues to get their views on different things, there's not a case study that went into that I couldn't think of as relating to my practice on a day-to-day basis. There may be people that work in an Oxbridge environment, Oxford, Cambridge, there may be people that might work in a what we would describe as a post-1992 institution, which are traditionally more diverse. But everything that I've found through reaching out to colleagues within the sector is that we can learn things from each other. And I continue to do that, even though there's, I would be on what you might term a professional services side. There are colleagues there who are writing from being primary role academics. I found that I learned a great deal from them as well. And it just, from that diversity, that we did find those common themes, and that was the highlight for me really in doing the book. I wanted to look at, having done the 2018 book, which I really describe now as what we think was going on in the sector at the time, based upon all of the literature, and we read up lots and lots. We all gave our opinion. We've all been working in the sector for 10, 15, 20 years, and this is what we thought was going on. But we can really say now that there were 150 applications for people to put things into this book. We ended up with 50 authors writing parts of it, 25 different case studies, just amazingly diverse, but the common themes I found really, really interesting. So kind of grouping that into how we were adapting to, as you say, a change in everything really over the last couple of years. And when we look back on writing this book or editing this book, we can't get away from the changes that we had. We did the call for proposals before lockdown and received lots of submissions for chapters just as we were going into that period. But as they've actually been written, the case studies, and we've then edited it and gone through the editing processes, we've done that as the sector has been reacting to this huge change that's kind of unavoidable. And that does come out in the case studies. There's lots of them that talk about how they adapted to it. And yes, as you say, like kind of writing a book, whereas previously we would do meetings online because Ben lives an hour away from me, but we got together before lockdown and went through all the different case studies and things like that. And we haven't got a chance to do that in the last, so that pretty much the entire process from that point on, myself, Ben, and even Andy, Ben and Andy live closer to each other, but the vast majority of it has been done online. We haven't had the opportunity to meet up and have a beer to celebrate it coming out, which is something I think we'd definitely like to do otherwise. And these case study authors that we've got to know really, really well in some respects, and we've gone back and forth and really been hands-on with kind of the case studies. There's still faces on a screen to us at the moment, so hoping that we'll get that first really in-person conference where we can get to see them a little bit more as we look back on the changes that have happened over the last couple of years. So I think that as we got to the latter stages of the book, when Ben was writing the introduction, I think it was very much forward looking as to see, okay, so there was what we did before. 2018 covered that pretty well. There was what we did in this interim period, what we're going to do in the future, what are the good things that we did before, but what are the things that actually we've improved upon, and how is that going to shape our professional practice going forward. And that's why I think the book, to me, I can say this because we edited rather than writing it, I think it really is so important to hear what's been happening in the sector from all of these excellent colleagues over the last couple of years, because I feel like there's been more change in the last 2 years than there have been in the previous 10. And it's a challenging time in wider society for many reasons. But I feel it's a really exciting and interesting time to be working in higher education, to be supporting students as they go into a working population that are facing different challenges to anything that's gone before. So yeah, it has really shaped what we did with the book, but I'm really optimistic about how that could have an impact as we go into the future.
So Ben and Dave, you know this too, but I'm going to direct my question to Ben. Part of the reason I'm even speaking with you right now is because my crazy brain made a connection between the publication of a book and the release of a blockbuster film. In the scholarship of academic advising and tutoring, it's not particularly common, even though I think our associations and our colleagues have done a lot of excellent work in the last couple decades to make it much more frequent that a book is published on our field. But I was at an annual conference, and the Academic Advising Approaches book, the teal one that's on my shelf back here behind me, was the first of 3, so the first of a trilogy. You can see where the Star Wars stuff is coming in, but it was released, and I was the nerdy person who was standing in line to get it signed by the authors who were in attendance. And I was looking back at that conference, that annual conference breakfast, and how many people were missing it. And in my world, if a major movie came out, if a Star Wars film had come out, it was a big deal. Everybody was talking about it. And at a conference about academic advising, a big thing had just been released. A book had just been published, and it seemed like people were disinterested. And we talked a little bit beforehand about the place of books in the scholarship of advising and tutoring. And Ben, I'm curious, your experience of having been involved in multiple publications now, where do you see this specific publication, its place in the scholarship of advising and tutoring, but then also the nature of books in general scholarship as well, as far as publications go?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Ryan, and it's one I've been forced to sort of grapple with, actually, because we have a not necessarily always wanted to, but we have a route in the UK to doctorate, actually, to PhD, called PhD by published works, or PhD by publication. And maybe in hindsight, I should have chosen a different route. But when I first got into HE, I was encouraged to take that route. Where alongside we have things like professional doctorates, and obviously the sort of traditional doctorate by thesis, PhD by thesis. Anyway, I was encouraged to take that route, and so therefore, I'm sure I would have thought about this anyway. But therefore, I've been forced to sort of spend a lot of time thinking and almost justifying how things that I've produced and me and other authors, co-authors, have produced fit in, how much they count. And I think one of the reasons, what am I trying to say? Some of the ways in which then they don't count are kind of institutional. So I hope overall the big picture is that these publications count, in that people will use them. And actually, in terms of this companion text, one of the most heartening things has been obviously to see how people have talked about in case studies how they've used the ideas from our 2018 book. So they're being used, so they count in that sense. But from an institutional perspective, and almost like HE, almost political perspective, I agree with you that they often get sort of neglected or forgotten, whether intentionally or not, I don't know. But maybe it's explained by the kind of institutional or wider sector politics to do with research funding, and to do with impact factors, and to do with, in the UK, something called the Research Excellence Framework, which we now have the Teaching Excellence Framework as well, that brings in money for research. And it does the things that we've produced for the books we've produced for critical publishing anyway, do not fit neatly into that gold standard or accepted format that academics, or maybe because of that wider institutional and sector perspective, have. They don't really sort of notice them unless they are national or international peer-reviewed journal articles or academic monographs. As Dave will know, we've had loads of interesting discussions with Emily about is our book a monograph, and real, real navel gazing stuff where you think you need to really get back into the real world and real world problems. But as I say, we've been forced to sort of consider these things, and it is an interesting question. When we looked at it, the monograph just meant a sort of, what does it mean in terms of an original contribution? But a traditional academic monograph, again, it tends to be more sort of empirical, research based, and our what we have at the sort of other end of the spectrum, I suppose, that can be a bit dismissed by people or forgotten by people, maybe unintentionally, is what we call in the UK practitioner texts, which are more sort of practical handbooks, pick them up. And they can be somewhat dismissed by certain academics because they're not necessarily based on primary research. And who makes up the rules here? I think it is a very interesting debate that we probably haven't got time for. But I think our books in particular sort of sit in some grey area between maybe those two extremes, in that they are practitioner texts. We have a bit of first person in there. We address the reader directly, which you wouldn't necessarily get in an academic monograph. However, they're also underpinned by a lot of research, desk-based research, and then these case studies obviously are based, some of them, on the primary research of the case study authors. So they're a kind of hybrid mixture of those things. And I think that might be one of the reasons they get possibly a bit lost. And so, we say, in the introduction to the case study collection, that it does sit within the literature in the sense of, we found a niche, hopefully, we found an area where there was a real need. And in the UK, you had a 2006 publication, which again is a book, but it's a collection of chapters written by certain individuals that, as quite often can happen, the precursor to that was a conference, and then that led to a book. So in 2006, Liz Thomas and Paula Hicksenbaugh, and Liz Thomas has done the foreword for the 2018 book and this new book. They brought together that collection in 2006. Then since then, you've kind of had really sporadic and intermittent contributions to the literature, and mainly been in the form of peer-reviewed papers. But they've been on, nothing against that, because I've published in it myself, small scale institutional research, and not a lot of which goes so far as to sort of have evidence the impact, the outcome of personal tutoring on students. Then obviously we tried to sort of fill the gap in practitioner texts underpinned by research with the 2015 book, which was called Becoming an Outstanding Personal Tutor for Further Education, and then the 2018 book. And then alongside that, within the literature, you've had the UCAT developments as well. And then in particular, as you all know, Wendy Troxell, and Emily and Dave and Lisa Rubin, doing the work on the global analysis of literature, which is that really sort of important piece of work going forward. So it's great to see that sort of interplay between the two. So interplay between the UK and the US, that's what I was going to say, and that this global analysis is being done. So I see it as, and then what's great about that last piece of work that I've mentioned as well is that what Wendy has done there is really appreciate the massive complexity about how you judge the literature in this field. Like I mentioned about the intertwined relationship between teaching and personal tutoring, you could argue there's a wealth of literature in this area, depending on how you define it. But, I still keep on coming back to, no, there is this gap, because there is this gap in specific emphasis that is needed in practice. So, yeah, hopefully it sits there it has an important place, I hope, within the literature. And maybe some of the reasons it doesn't always get picked up on is it because it doesn't fit within that format that maybe a lot of people just get so used to recognizing that somehow it doesn't fit neatly into that, and therefore doesn't always get picked up on. But hopefully, a timely and important contribution in some way, nevertheless.
Certainly, and I think one of the things that your response typifies, that even a publication in advising and tutoring demonstrates how there's this sort of third space. We have some friends and colleagues, some of whom you mentioned, who are working on and have published around the concept of third space professionals and integrated professionalism, and this notion that sometimes the existing structures aren't the best fit for what advising and tutoring is, what advisors and tutors are, and what they do, and what student needs are in those spaces. And that maybe a third space is the best way to contextualize it. That was one of the things that I noticed, not only in the introduction and the forward to the new book, but also in our conversation so far, is that at times there can be these, they seem like contradictions, or perhaps they're more like paradoxes or whatever. And I was wondering if you had a particular favorite one that either came out of the book or that's just been part of your life as a professional tutor or whatever, that sometimes it seems like this, but then sometimes it's like that. The sort of paradoxical nature of it. I think our friend Oscar van der Windgaard might refer to that as like really resting in praxis, right? Like there's these two sides and it's the interplay that matters most. But I didn't know if you had a particular favorite or one that really was resonating with you from the experience of this book or just in general. Dave?
Yeah, well, we had a couple of quotes that we've been looking at as part of the book, and things. One of them, which didn't go into the published version of the book, but it was kind of not a mantra, but I guess a quote that was in our minds, which was the cause and solution to all life's problems. Which the original quote is talking about beer as being the cause and solution to all life's problems, and is referring to Homer Simpson, if you know it. But we kind of spoke about that being how advising or tutoring sometimes is seen, and that when there is in the UK, it would be that there's a teaching excellence framework that comes out. There's a student survey, and institutions are trying to make their students a lot more happy, make them succeed more. Oh, the solution to that is this. It can be advising and tutoring, but if it's not happening, then the problem kind of rests with them. And certainly something in the UK that it's not been the established field, perhaps as much as it's becoming more and more in the States, where it's got that research credibility alongside the practitioner. And that's what I guess we've tried to do to kind of navigate between the two of them, to make sure that when we've quoted all the literature, we've read everything that's out there, we've read the international sources, we've read things in the UK, and that's what we put into the 2018 book, and it's very, very well referenced within that. But at the same time, we didn't want it to be kind of a dry academic thing that people would read. We would want it to be people to pick up and to go back to before a session with a student, after a session with a student, and to hear as part of the book launch when we launched the book 3 or 4 weeks ago, that somebody said about the 2018 book, they said it had been their Bible over the last 3 or 4 years. And that was really the best thing that I think we could ever hear as co-authors of that book. I want to see, it's great to see if somebody's had the book, but we're definitely not in it for the money, because you don't make money in publishing, as I'm sure colleagues listening know. But we're there for the impact that it will have. And if we can see from somebody that actually that book is a bit of a state because they've been going back to it, and when they have a meeting with a student, they find a certain section of the book that they'll go back to afterwards. So that's kind of what that's why I feel most comfortable in that third space in between the two of them, because like Ben, I've gone down various different routes of considering a PhD and done some classes in the States towards one, and I want to have that academic rigor, but I also want it to be something that's actually going to have an impact upon real life students. When I've spoken to colleagues about doing kind of PhDs, and they say, well, you could do it in anything, you could go into something else. Or, well, actually, I want it to have an impact in students. That's the point of it, and that's what we've done with the books, is to try and make it so that it can be that solution to those problems. That on an individual level, a practitioner would think, I'm facing this challenge. What can I do to go overcome that, to get around it? And hopefully the two books, most recently the one which has got those case studies, they will draw upon the real life examples of other colleagues who've come across similar challenges in the sector and have sought to overcome it together, because we tried to add, as editors, really that rigor to them, to make sure, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that mean to the wider sector? What's the impact? It's great that you think this has happened. I'm not doubting for a second that it has, but how can you show that? And that's what really we spent 18 months with the authors kind of working through. And that's why we're really proud of where they've got to with each of the case studies, because I think they really do show honest, real solutions that they at an institutional level have found and really had an impact upon students. And I guess our job as editors has just been trying to bring them all up together so that there's some uniformity in some things, but some respect for the diversity of the different submissions that we got, so that from the reader's perspective, as they go through it, they can look at the different themes, they can compare from one to another, and some things they might strike a chord with them, they might think is relevant to them, some things they might not feel is as relevant, and they can put it into their practice on a day-to-day basis. So that's what I found, that are we the cause to things? Are we the solution to things? I'm hoping we've moved towards being the solution, and that's part of what we published here.
Absolutely. So Ben, do you have a favorite paradox?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a paradox. There's another word. It's funny because the amount, I've not done loads, but conference presentations, conundrum. That's one that seems to crop up in the title of, ends up being in the title of some of my presentations that I've given to various conferences. And the reason for that has been something like tackling the personal tutoring conundrum is the title of one of my articles as well. And the reason for that has been probably what we've already touched on, which is why have we got something here, personal tutoring advising, that is absolutely central, should be absolutely central and crucial, and yet receives so little attention? And I think, to answer that, it probably goes back to some of the things we've just been discussing previously, about its place and about people maybe not seeing it, practitioners or managers maybe not seeing it for what it is. One of the ones that came out of the book that was a kind of favorite, I'm not sure it's a paradox. Don't think it is. But in terms of a quote and sort of to remember, and again, maybe it is a paradox given what we've just said about how important this activity is. But one of our two of our case study authors, co-authors from Manchester Metropolitan University, came up with, when they talked to staff and students, a lot of them caricatured personal tutoring as two people in a room that neither wants to be in for a purpose that is unclear to both. And, when they came up with that line, I was like, that's me 20 years ago as a new teacher. That's how I felt, and that's how the student felt. And yet here it is on my job description, albeit with no explanation. And here it is, on my timetable. And so it's, not sure that's a paradox, but that's that is the challenge. And as we've said, that's a key challenge, as Dave's already said, that we're trying to hopefully solve and make that no longer the case for both the student and the staff who is involved in a tutoring interaction.
Well, certainly having spent the time that I have with the book and the previous book and the work that y'all done, I know that the clarification efforts are well underway. And I appreciate so much your time today, giving us a perspective of just that kind of commitment to the community that's being built, the communities of practice, and refining the important activity of personal tutoring and academic advising through scholarly efforts. The personal connections and the conversations that we have the opportunity to have in these informal spaces are so valuable and so meaningful, but without the work of formal sharing of scholarly perspectives, whether through presentations or publication, whatever shape they may take. Sometimes it's folks just talking about work. But we have the opportunity, I think, as academic advisors and personal tutors, to readily engage in these conversations. And this podcast is just one of the many ways. But I'm honored to say that I have had the chance to get to know folks like you from all across the world who do work that is very similar to and shares far more in common with the work that I do than a couple of words or terminology differences. And so thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Dave and Ben, and congratulations to you and Andy as well on this publication. I look forward to it being of use to me in my practice and for many more to discover it. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Great to be here. Thank you.